Hello and welcome to the Very Cold Lasagna podcast, your place for all you filthy casual takes on the world of sports, for you filthy casual fans out there like you and me. I am your host, Dylan Lasagna, and this is episode number 276, and in this episode, we're here to continue along our 2025 NFL season team preview month here on the podcast, and I can't believe it. We're already halfway through our team preview month, our team-by-team previews, and we've already done 4 divisions, 16 teams in our team previews. So those divisions being the NFC West, the AFC West, the AFC North, and the NFC North. So in this part number 5, and the next episode, we're going to be going down south. But in this part number 5, number 6, I think that's how you do it in Spanish. But nonetheless, we're going to go down south, and I'm talking about the NFC South in this episode. So in case you missed any of the previous 4 editions of our team by team 2025 previews, after this episode, make sure you go back and listen to the previous 4 editions of our team by team previews and the 4 divisions that we've already covered. So make sure you listen to those episodes after this one, whether it's on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast that Very Cold Lasagna is available on. And then follow my socials on social media at Very Cold Lasagna and continue the conversation over there. And all my other filthy casual takes as well. So, that being said, let's get right into it. Let's get right into the conversation. And some teams have started training camp so far. A very select few, but there haven't been any updates. And it's actually been a very quiet off-season, to be fair. I mean, obviously, not much is going on other than the updates that I've shared in our team-by-team previews. But not to dilly-dally along further, let's get into our first team in the NFC South. And one has often been referred to as the Big Easy, but unfortunately has been the Big Hard, as I've always referred them to in the last couple of years. And I'm talking about the New Orleans Saints. So the Saints, they actually got off to a relatively surprising start last year, starting off 2-0, and they were being the brakes off of teams like the Carolina Panthers and even the Dallas Cowboys. But then they quickly fell off a cliff with a 7-game losing streak full of subpar offensive performances that were worsened not just by injuries, and one of those injured people included their quarterback, Derek Carr, and that led to a roulette of bad backup quarterbacks and bad coaching, leading to the mid-season firing of Dennis Allen. And what led to all that? The Saints winding up finishing dead last in the division for the first time since 2008, and a season low record of 5-12 at the end of the 2024 campaign. And towards the end of things, they were left with many questions once again about their gloomy future. They're not just in the short term, but in the long term, because, well, you got a very flawed roster with many holes. And you're once again the worst team in the NFL when it comes to money. You don't have any money to spend. You're like very low in the red, and you have to get rid of all that dead money, all that cap space that you're in the red for. Not only that, they lost a WrestleMania in New Orleans that they openly, publicly stated by The Rock. They had The Rock go out there and announced that WrestleMania 42 was coming to New Orleans. Only 3 months later, have it snatched away from them to bring it back to Las Vegas the very next year. Talk about big oof. This is why I called New Orleans the Big Hard, because yes, hard times have definitely been the thing that has been happening to this city of NOLA. So when it comes to football, when it comes to the New Orleans Saints, obviously, your goal for 2025, this upcoming season in about a month or so, is, well, to try and bring any kind of optimism. Try to bring some positivity, because there hasn't been any in the last 3 seasons since, well, Drew Brees retired. So you have to bring some kind of optimism to this team, despite still being in cap hell. So looking at some of their needs going into this this upcoming season and what they need to do in this past offseason, well, there were a lot. There were obviously a lot, but some of the things that they had to do was replenish that cornerback room because they traded away Marshawn Lattimore, perhaps their best corner, and they traded him away to the Washington Commanders, and they expectedly lost Paulson Adebo in free agency. So they really need to find some help for probably one of their most brightest spots in the last season in Kool-Aid McKinstry, their rookie. They had to give him some help there, maybe another corner or two. They also needed to get some more help at wide receiver because receiver depth was a major problem after Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, and even Taysom Hill, their big utility player, they all went down with injuries. So stocking up at that spot was very important to prevent that from happening again. Like really stocking up at depth in case all of them went down again. And then you had to find alternative options at quarterback because Derek Carr had been bringing middling results to the Saints since he signed on with the team. And rookie Spencer Rattler couldn't step up to the plate when filling in after Carr was lost with injury last season. So the Saints really need to start thinking about finding an actual quarterback that could eventually take the keys from Derek Carr in the long run. So we'll get to Derek Carr later on because something significant happened later on in the offseason for the Saints. So earlier on in the offseason for New Orleans, so obviously we know Dennis Allen was fired midseason and interim coach Darren Rizzi was not retained as the full-time head coach. So they replaced both of them with former Eagles offensive coordinator Kellen Moore as the head coach. So obviously they saw what went down in the Super Bowl with Philadelphia, and they immediately hired coordinator Kellen Moore as their head coach. So Moore was fresh off of winning a Super Bowl in New Orleans, ironically, with Philadelphia. But looking at this team, look how it's constructed. Yeah, he has a very tall task ahead of him, trying to rebuild this squad with very little to no resources. And something else major he won't have. And this ties back to Derek Carr. Derek Carr announcing his retirement around late April to early May. So this sudden announcement was a result of a severe rotator cuff injury that Carr had been dealing with for a long while, and Carr lost feeling in his throwing shoulder this offseason trying to rehab it, which would have resulted in him missing all of this upcoming season had he stayed around. Now, there were mixed rumors prior to this retirement announcement, and even prior to all these rumors of injury popping up, that the Saints were trying to trade him anyway. But now they're left with a major pickle on their hands to solve because they have no real starting quarterback on their roster to proven otherwise. And sure, they're trying to get this quarterback competition resolved with the quarterbacks I'm going to talk about. But yeah, there's no real starting quarterback as we speak. So looking at some of the moves that they made in the offseason, and obviously it's limited because they have no real money to spend. No, they didn't really lose anyone to note, but at the same time, they didn't really add anyone to note. The only notable loss that they had was corner Paulson Adebo, but that was pretty much it. The only real notable people that they add was, well, a reunion with receiver Brandon Cooks from the Cowboys, but we'll see how that plays out. And looking at some of the draft moves they made, they added an offensive lineman in Kelvin Banks Jr., and that was pretty controversial by a lot of analysts, and I'm not sure why. They also added from Texas defensive tackle Vernon Broughton. And then this is probably the other controversial move that the Saints made. Quarterback by the name of Tyler Show from Louisville. So that was the two big notable names coming out of the draft for the Saints. So when you look at this offseason for New Orleans, you know it's going to be a very, very long season for the entire team, including the new head coach, Kellen Moore. So on top of a shaky quarterback situation, the depth at receiver behind Olave and Shaheed, it wasn't addressed much, and that could be troublesome if either go down again. If neither Spencer Rattler nor Show or whoever is behind both of them, or at least serviceable at best. And looking at that quarterback competition between Spencer Rattler and Tyler Show and whoever else the Saints signed on to compete with both of them. Yeah. This quarterback situation for the Saints is not gonna look. Is not looking good. Is not looking good, especially considering that Tyler Show, who they drafted, has a major injury history. It's a very lengthy injury history. So, yeah, I mean, if you're a Saints fan, it's gonna look real rough unless proven otherwise. Unless they prove me otherwise wrong. But there are a few silver linings for them. The trenches should be a little bit better with the additions of Kelvin Banks Jr. And I know that's a controversial pick for Saints fans. And Will Clapp is also there. And the overall defense, while it still has some issues, they should be able to keep them a little bit competitive this season with the additions for Cam Jordan, Tyrann Mathieu, and Kool-Aid McKinstry. So they get a little bit more help. So at least the defense should be able to hold up its end of the bargain. So looking at some of the key games this upcoming season for the Saints, obviously with a team like New Orleans that's going to be rebuilding and retooling, you obviously look towards the first 2 games of the year. Weeks 1 to 2, you get a little bit of a gauntlet, and the entire NFC, the large majority of the NFC West, taking on the Arizona Cardinals and the San Francisco 49ers, both at home. And then you go on the road to take on Seattle and Sam Darnold and the Seahawks. So you're facing the 3 of the 4 teams in the NFC West right away. And that's going to be how you're going to be envisioning the NFC and, well, just yourselves entirely. So the biggest question for the Saints going into this upcoming season is, well, one overall question. Can they shut the doubters up like me? Can they shut me and the entire doubters up? When I mean this, like, I don't mean win a crap ton of games, because looking at this flawed team, it's more than likely not going to happen until proven otherwise. And they have a poorly constructed roster. But what I mean by this is exceeds some expectations that most didn't expect, and put on respectable showings in some of these games, and maybe pull off a few upsets or two. You know, Kellen Moore has to rally this team together despite a poorly constructed roster. So the Saints, they received a big shock this offseason with the sudden retirement of Derek Carr, and now they're stuck with a major pickle at quarterback. Who knows who's going to emerge as a starting quarterback by the end of the preseason. While I don't expect them to go too far again in the big hard, they're at least finally embracing somewhat of a rebuild after I mentioned, in my opinion, that they really need to embrace this rebuild 2 years ago, since Drew Brees retired, that they need to finally embrace a rebuild because, well, they're practically forced to. And now they're going to do it this upcoming season. So moving on to the big hard, we go down to north of the South to look at the big bad blue kitties and look at the Carolina Panthers. So the kitties in blue last season, they were off to a very, very bad start. They were 1-7 to start 2024 because they had the absolute worst defense in the NFL. And they had very poor play from second-year quarterback Bryce Young, which led to him getting benched for backup Andy Dalton, only for him to be just as bad, if not worse, than Bryce Young. So by midseason, Bryce Young got the starting job back after the bye week, and it was actually a reverse of how he did after the 1-7 start, after the early benching for Bryce Young. And he finished the rest of the season on a high note, playing like the quarterback that the Panthers were hoping they were going to get out of him when they drafted him. Even though he didn't win that many games after he returned from the bench, he put on some respectable showings. And in the last 2 games of the season, he helped them win 2 straight games. And not only that, he eliminated 2 teams that were trying to compete for playoff spots. So now with this renewed glimmer of hope coming out of the 2024 campaign, sure, they finished 5-12 and 3rd for the NFC South. The Panthers, for the first time in quite a long while, they felt a little bit positive going into this past offseason. So it was on Dave Canales, the head coach, and general manager Dan Morgan to carry the positives of last season into this past offseason and build around their quarterback. So now the ultimate goal for 2025, this upcoming season, is to compete with the Tampa Bay Bucks and the Atlanta Falcons for the NFC South. Try to be that X factor in this division in what could possibly be a three-way race. But to do that, some of the needs that they had to address this past offseason was to fix that league worst defense from last year, because they need to fix pretty much almost all the positions, especially that secondary. So they really need to upgrade basically every position, like at corner, at safety, the front four, the front seven. Pretty much every single position needs to be upgraded. And if they want to have a little like a single chance at competing against even their own division, they need to address that whole dang defense. They also need to get Bryce Young 2 new top receivers, especially young receivers. Xavier Legette is still a wait and see type receiver. Sure, he had some flashes of good moments, but there were also some pretty bad ones at that, especially when he dropped the ball literally in a potential winning situation against the Eagles at one point last year. And then Adam Thielen is still reliable, but he's also getting older. So getting Young some more help, and I mean literally Young, in the draft was an absolute must to help Bryce Young take that next step. So looking at some of the things that happened for the Panthers this past offseason, they re-signed a couple of their players, like backup Andy Dalton in the event that Bryce Young does poorly again. They also re-signed receiver David Moore, Mike Jackson at corner, and backup running back Raheem Blackshear. They also gave an extension to one of their top corners, J.C. Horn, to a big, fat 4-year extension. It was kind of strange that they did that, especially at the price tag that they did, because J.C. Horn, this was like his best season that he had, and one that he finally stayed healthy in the last year or so. Like after, 2 or 3 seasons in the league, he was unable to do so. So this season better prove that he could stay healthy. And anyway, they also released running back Miles Sanders after they gave him that big deal after that season with Philadelphia. And then looking at some of their offseason moves, they didn't really lose anyone of note, to be honest with you. But they also didn't really add too many people of note, other than adding some help at the defensive line, like Tershawn Warren and Bobby Brown from the Chiefs and the Rams. And then linebacker Christian Roseboom from the Rams also. So getting a little bit more help for that defense, I guess. But the draft is where they did their dirty work. And they got Bryce Young a little bit of help. Like receiver Tario McMillan from Arizona. Some people were questioning that pick, but at the same time, the Panthers did need some help and gave Bryce Young that receiver that he needed. Some of the picks were also used to help out the defense, and especially that front four, like edge rushers Nick Scorton and Princely Million. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And then safety Lathon Ransom, and then defensive tackle Cam Jackson. So looking at how this offseason panned out for Carolina, the Panthers didn't really lose anyone significant, but they didn't really add anyone of note either. Like I said, the Panthers really need to hit on their offseason needs. And they had actually a decent amount of money and resources to do so. And I just felt like, sure, I think they nailed the draft decently, but I feel like they didn't really use it to their advantage. The pass rush, it may be better. They did at least use some of their draft picks on addressing the defensive line. But help was still badly needed for the NFL's worst secondary. And the Panthers didn't do enough to address that. Sure, they got a new safety, but they still need help at corner. And maybe they got some of that with some of their undrafted free agents that could step up to the plate. But I feel like they still need help in that secondary. Maybe some of that will come out in training camp, in the preseason, and maybe later on in the regular season. So Bryce Young still needs that help on the opposite side of the ball if the Panthers want to succeed. And at least, on speaking of Bryce Young, they at least did address getting him some more help in the passing game in McMillan, but he does apparently come with some work ethic issues. I'm not sure if that has changed throughout the offseason activities that have happened so far, but hopefully it has changed. Hopefully McMillan has matured. So we'll see. So looking at some of the key games this upcoming season for the Panthers, you look at a team like Carolina, who are still rebuilding, who are still looking to find themselves in this division race between them, Tampa, and Atlanta. You look towards the first 3 games to see what they're worth. They head out for a 2-game road trip to take on the Jaguars and the Cardinals to start out the season, and then they have their home opener in a key division game against the Atlanta Falcons and Michael Penix Jr. So obviously, we look towards how Bryce Young is going to fare in his 3rd year. This is his 3rd year in the league. I feel like he turned it up a notch around the back half of the 2024 campaign, but it was a relatively small sample size. And he'll have to make things work again with a middle-length supporting cast other than having McMillan as his top receiver. And, still having not really that second X-factor receiver other than Leggett and Adam Thielen, who still have, especially Leggett, who still has to prove himself. So, yeah, the Panthers do make a lot of upgrades on offense, but yeah, it'll still be on Bryce Young to find a way to turn things around despite the middling supporting cast, in my opinion. And then, obviously, we'll have to wait and see how these defensive additions, or not really much, if they can do better than expected, especially when you look at that secondary. How are they going to do? And that's a wait and see approach. So I was hoping that the Panthers would follow through on seriously, being a little bit more serious to address their top offseason needs. They had the resources, but they just didn't take advantage of it. They kind of half-assed it. I'm a little bit intrigued, though, to see how Bryce Young pans out in his year 3, despite that, though. But he and these kitties in blue are on a slightly higher microscope, and they have themselves on a little bit more of target on their backs going into this upcoming season after last year's mid-season turnaround. Will they step up to the plate, though? Will they challenge themselves to be better than last year? Well, let's see. And if they do so, they can be a threat to the Atlanta Falcons. They can even be a threat to the Tampa Bay Bucks and be involved in a triple threat for the NFC South. But yeah, even with not addressing these needs seriously, maybe the Panthers can do better than expected this upcoming season. So moving on from the kitties in blue, we look at the Dirty Birds and look at the Atlanta Falcons. So coming off the heels of a eventful weekend for the WWE with Saturday night's main event, and an all women's pay-per-view in Evolution for the WWE. I mean, good for the women's roster, and good for the WWE putting on Saturday night's main event, and of course, all to compete with AEW All In pettiness at its finest. I mean, but it is what it is. But going back to football, for the Atlanta Falcons last year, they started off 6-3. That included a sweep of their division rival Tampa Bay Bucks. It seemed like they were firmly on the cusp. They had the division firmly grasped midway through the season. But of course, the Falcons falconed again afterwards. After turnovers and poor defense from Kirk Cousins on the turnover side of things, and their defense, they played terribly, which led to Kirk Cousins getting benched for first-round pick Michael Penix Jr. for the last 3 games of the year. Now, despite some promising returns from the rookie, it was too little too late, because they lost their last 2 of 3 key games and the NFC South to the Tampa Bay Bucks. So they finished the season 8-9, but the important thing is at least your rookie looks pretty promising. But again, it was too little too late to save the season for Atlanta. So now, obviously, questions now point towards Michael Penix Jr. Getting this full offseason to prepare for obviously what looks like to him being the full-time starter. But also Kirk Cousins with this big fat contract of his, and Atlanta not being able to find a trade partner for Kirk Cousins because, they were fiddling around with that situation. Now Kirk Cousins having to accept being a big fat contracted backup. So yeah, it's a very icky situation in Atlanta. That doesn't also include that coming off a loaded weekend for the WWE. So obviously your goal for 2025, if you're the Dirty Birds in Atlanta, is to try and dethrone the Atlanta Bucks. Not the Atlanta, but the Tampa Bay Bucks. I'm getting all these teams mixed up. To dethrone the Atlanta Bucks. There he goes again. the Tampa Bay Bucks to win the NFC South. And obviously to see Michael Penix Jr. Progress and develop well with this team. Hopefully I don't mix these cities and the team names up again. So anyway, looking at some of the needs for the Atlanta Falcons this upcoming offseason, the past offseason, by the way, is to add help to a bad defense because they had serious struggles pressuring the quarterback and struggled in pass defense for a few years. And all the attempts that they had at adding help, it failed. It failed miserably. So they really need to truly retool it. And obviously, they need to add help for their new second-year quarterback. Darnell Mooney and Ray McLeod, they were decent reserves for the 3 games Penix started, but as the new full-time starter, Atlanta needs to give him a actual number 2 alongside Drake London and Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts specifically, he really needs to prove himself as that tight end that could be for Atlanta because he's been around the league for how many years now? Since 2021, and he's had mixed results. And they did extend him for that. They picked up his 5th-year option, I believe, from what I remember a month or two ago. So he really needs to step up to the plate, and if he doesn't, they could let him walk. So looking at some of the things that happened this past offseason for the Falcons, in a questionable move, they released Grady Jarrett. That was very surprising given their pass rush struggles. But they did make a move to help out in that department later on. But I still found it very surprising given that he was one of their best players in the pass rush despite the issues there. But I'm not sure why they did that. They also re-signed corner Mike Hughes. Now looking towards their free agency moves, one of the biggest losses, actually the biggest loss the Falcons had, was their offensive lineman at center, Drew Dalman. Like, he was the best player on their offensive line, and that was going to be pretty difficult to replace. So looking at the people that they did add, they actually had some pretty good additions for their defense. Linebacker Divine Diablo for the Raiders, and then edge rushers Leonard Floyd and Morgan Fox from the 49ers and the Chargers. So they made some good investments in the defense, despite not having any money to spend, barely any money to spend in free agency. So looking at the draft, that's where they did some more of their dirty work. They continued to address the front 4 by adding edge rushers Jalon Walker and James Pierce. Jalon Walker was a very good pick for Atlanta. They also continued to address the secondary by adding safeties Xavier Watts and Billy Bauman. And then they addressed the offensive line somewhat by adding Jack Nelson from Wisconsin. So looking at Atlanta's offseason, obviously the big priority was addressing that front 7, which in my opinion could be much better than it was in previous seasons. And hopefully it pans out because, as I mentioned, all this attempts to adding help to that group, it failed. But hopefully it pans out better this time. Because obviously this is the biggest improvement for the Falcons from the offseason. While the secondary, it still has question marks. But they did a good job in that group of the front 7. They added a good mix of veteran and rookie depth at edge rusher. And I believe they got a very good linebacker in Divine Diablo. So pressuring the quarterback, run defense, and protecting the middle of the field should be better for them this season. And I believe Divine Diablo checks all those boxes. So the improvements to the defense do come at the cost of the lack of additions at offense because, again, they didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of draft picks. And I still question, I think it was Atlanta that gave away a first round, traded up for a first round pick. Or was it the Giants? I don't remember, but I think it was Atlanta that traded up back into the first round. It was a very dumb move for them. But either way, again, they had to choose one or the other either way to adjust their major needs at the cost of the other. So looking at some of the key games this upcoming season, you look towards their first 3 games, especially for a team that's going to be trying out a relatively new quarterback in Penix Jr. And we'll talk about him in just a second. But looking at some of the key games, you host the Tampa Bay Bucks in a very early pivotal division game. And then you look towards a road trip in weeks 2 to 3. You go to Minnesota to take on the Vikings. And then you head out to Carolina to take on Bryce Young and the Panthers. An interesting game between 2 young stud quarterbacks. So looking at this upcoming season for the Falcons, you look towards how Michael Penix Jr. is going to pan out as the full-time starter. So this 3-game sample size last season is obviously too small to understand how he's going to stack for the upcoming year. So there was some flashes, though, based on how he played in the Falcons' last 2 games that especially had playoff implications. You saw how he did against the Commanders, and I thought he played relatively good in that game against Washington, but the inexperience was there. But I thought he stepped up in some of the game's crucial moments, but it just fell relatively short. But yeah, again, that 3-game sample size is still relatively short, too small to understand how he's going to do for what's going to may end up being a full game, a full season for Atlanta. But he'll have to make the most of a kind of middling supporting cast outside of Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Bijan Robinson, though. So for the Falcons, I think they did okay to address the defense. More than okay. They did very solid to address the defense this offseason, which was a major key need. Again, it came at the cost, though, addressing the offense. But the key to success this year will be how Michael Penix Jr. Will perform with the spotlight shining even brighter on him. How he does will determine whether or not the Falcons, the Atlanta Falcons, and not the Atlanta, you know what. Anyway, how Michael Penix Jr. how he does will determine whether or not the Falcons can keep pace with the Tampa Bay Bucks and Baker Mayfield, and possibly even Bryce Young and the Panthers in what may be a triple threat race for the NFC South. So speaking of the NFC South, we look at the multi-time and multi-straight division champion to wrap things up in this episode. We look towards the defending champions once again, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So we head down to the pirate ship and look at this Bucs squad who last season started out 3-1. And in a familiar tale from last season and I believe also the season before, they underwent a midseason slump despite starting 3-1. A midseason slump that included close losses, a season sweep to the Falcons, and an avoidable season-ending injury to their top receiver, their number 2 receiver, to Chris Godwin. They fell 4-6, and it seemed like their season was pretty much over from there. Like, you got swept by the Falcons, and you were well behind them. So all hope seemed to be lost for this Tampa Bay Bucs squad, and I'm not sure. I still question, even many months later, why you had to trot out Chris Godwin in a blowout to the Ravens on a Monday night game. But they managed to rebound late in the year to win their final 6 or 7 games, and they caught up to the free-falling Falcons in the division race to win the NFC South again. Unfortunately, in their only playoff game, they wound up losing to Jaden Daniels and the Commanders in a rematch from week 1 in familiar heartbreaking fashion during their midseason slump. And yeah, that was pretty much a wrap for that Tampa Bay Bucs squad in 2024. But nonetheless, Baker Mayfield has at least finally found his home. He at least manages to rally his team around him despite, losing key players and having to deal with reserves. He at least manages to make the most out of his players and managed to get the best out of them. But this team still remains flawed from making a deeper run, and they need to fix some things this offseason if they want to do more than just repeat as NFC South champions. So obviously that is the goal for 2025 for Tampa Bay. You got to do more in the playoffs because the most you did was 2 years ago. Make it oh so close into making the NFC Championship game, only to fall an interception. An interception so close against the Detroit Lions. And you're just that close to making it to the NFC Championship game. But anyway, look at some of their key offseason needs for Tampa Bay from the last couple of months. They need some help in the passing defense in the draft because this has been their biggest weakness in the last 3 years. And it was a major killer in their loss to the Commanders in that wildcard game. The Bucs really need to use at least half of their picks to address this area and really get help for Jamel Dean, Zion McCollum, and Antoine Winfield. Speaking of Jamel Dean, he's getting older, and I'm just gonna address it now. Actually, he could be on the verge of getting cut. Like seriously, he from what I've seen in like these articles and tweets that are out there, he's potentially getting beat in training camp. From what I saw, not training camp, my mini camps, OTAs, potentially getting beat out by the younger players. So he could be a potential casualty in these final roster cuts. So it's a interesting storyline to watch in this final build up to the regular season. So yeah, that was the main need the Bucs need to resolve. Some of the things that the Bucs did this past offseason, not really too much that happened, but they did re-sign a lot of the key players like receiver Chris Godwin, guard Ben Bredesen, linebacker Levante David, and edge rusher Anthony Nelson. So they're bringing back a good amount of their core players from the last couple of years. They didn't really do a lot in free agency because of limited money, but they also didn't really lose a lot or add a lot in that period. So not really too much people to note. They did add edge rusher Hassan Reddick from the Jets on a 1-year deal, and a bunch of Riley Dixon from Denver. And looking towards the draft, they did most of their dirty work there by adding receivers Emeka Egbuka and Tez Johnson. Yeah, my pronunciation's all over the place. They did get some help in the secondary, like corners Benjamin Morrison and Jacob Parrish, and then getting some younger help in the pass rush like David Walker and Elijah Roberts. So a lot of their help came a lot of their draft picks came on defense, and that's my big takeaway from this Bucs offseason. Those defensive draft additions can potentially fix some of their major defensive problems. And it might not be solved entirely and not right away, but it does make them younger. It does inject some youth into the Bucs defense, especially going back to Jamel Dean being potentially cut, being a casualty by those final roster cuts, and which obviously sucks, but it's the name of the game. So Tampa using most of their picks on defense and their picks being of good value will keep them in very solid position to retain the NFC South for the 5th straight season. So, yeah, I believe that's a good approach on how Tampa Bay used their offseason and the draft. What I don't understand though is the criticism towards the Bucs using their first round pick on Emeka Egbuka. again, I'm sorry for mispronouncing that receiver's name, because yeah, they needed another receiver. Baker Mayfield made the most of a severely lacking receiving core when Mike Evans missed a lot of time last season, and Chris Godwin was unnecessarily injured in garbage time against the Ravens last year. So it made a lot of sense for them to draft Egbuka in case both of them or one of them went down. So I understand some people's frustrations on the Bucs using that first rounder to draft Egbuka, but they need a strong depth. They really need a strong depth at the receiver spot. So looking at some of the key games for the Bucs this upcoming season, there are a couple of them as the defending champions of the division. You look towards the first 2 games of the year, starting on the road, taking on Atlanta and Michael Penix Jr., and then you go on to Houston to take on C.J. Stroud and the Texans. That's kind of a tough stretch for the Bucs. And then you return home to face Philadelphia once again, ironically in week 4, which has happened how many times in the last 4 years? They faced Philadelphia in week 4 again. It's always early in the season for some reason. They take on the defending Super Bowl champions Jalen Hurts and the Eagles in week 4 all the time. This, once again, it's going to happen again. And then they face the Detroit Lions on the road in week 7. So we look towards how things are going to pan out for Tampa Bay, especially on defense. These defensive additions, and whether or not we'll see all these improvements pan out. So I'm interested to see how things are going to work out on the defensive side of the ball, and whether or not we'll see improvements to it. And how is Baker Mayfield going to adjust to his 3rd straight new offensive coordinator? Because, well, Liam Cohen is now the head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars, and they had to go and get another offensive coordinator for Baker Mayfield. So this is like his 3rd straight new coordinator. Baker Mayfield can never catch a break when it comes to sticking to one offensive coordinator for at least 2 straight seasons. Give the man a break, man. I guess the coordinators are just so popular. So anyway, the Bucs are pretty much running it back with mostly the same people that they had the last 2 seasons, other than the offensive coordinator for Baker Mayfield. There is a couple new people, especially on the defensive side of the ball. But the thing is, complacency is eventually bound to hit a wall, especially for this Bucs squad. And if the offseason changes around the other 2 teams, like the Falcons and the Panthers, and if both of those teams really live up to the hype, and especially the Panthers, if they really exceed their expectations and really challenge both of those teams, then the Bucs could have some serious troubles on their hands against Atlanta and Carolina in the NFC South for the first time in a while. So the Bucs really need to be careful not to get complacent and not have another midseason slump that could end up being a rest of season slump. So they got to be careful this upcoming season. So that's pretty much a wrap on this episode of Very Cold Lasagna, and a wrap on our NFC South 2025 preview, covering the New Orleans Saints, the Carolina Panthers, the Atlanta Falcons, and the Tampa Bay Bucks. Let me know whether or not you're a fan of these teams. Let me know how those teams are gonna do this upcoming season, and what is your take, your opinions on how they're gonna do? What is your biggest expectation for them? Let's have a conversation about it, whether it's in the comments on YouTube or send me a message on social media at Very Cold Lasagna. But yeah, that's going to do it for this episode of Very Cold Lasagna, episode number 276 of this icy yet spicy podcast for all your filthy casual takes on the world of sports, for all the sports casual fans out there like me and you. I have been your host, Dylan Lasagna, and until the next time, keep that lasagna very cold in the fridge with your takes, and until I see you, when I see you in the next one, and for the next part of our 2025 NFL season team preview month. Peace out.